have what I thought was going to be a keynote, but sounds more like you're just going to give your spiel, is L2s are not the future of blockchain scaling. So a little bit controversial, which I think the person standing to my right is, yeah, very, very renowned for. So I'd like to introduce Justin Bonds. Please give a round of applause. Enjoy.
Hello. All right. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. And I'm up on stage here with what is indeed a bit of a controversial opinion, especially for an Ethereum conference. So it's my view that layer 2 scaling is very much the wrong path for Ethereum to go towards. I believe that for most of Ethereum's history, execution sharding was actually solidly on the roadmap. And about a year ago, there was a pivot, by the Ethereum Foundation and by the community, by the developer community at large, to pivot away from execution sharding and focus on a layer 2 based roadmap. Now, this is fundamentally something that I disagree with, and I'm going to explore why I disagree with this decision. And there's multiple reasons why, but I'd like to focus on one of the big reasons why, which is that, well, first of all, if we look at some of the largest layer 2s, take Polygon, which has an admin key, which is able to steal all user funds that live within the Polygon contract that exceeds over $1 billion. If we look at Optimism, its smart contract also has an admin key, which is also able to steal user funds, also exceeding several $1 billion. We have Arbitrum, which also has an admin key controlled by a multi-sig, which is also able to steal user funds. Right? Like, this to me is very much goes against the very ethos of cryptocurrency and what we're trying to build here. And the pivot away from execution sharding by Ethereum has been my biggest disappointment in cryptocurrency over the last few years. Not FTX, not Free Arrows Capital, not regulation, not the bear market. No, I think fundamentally speaking, I think the most harm is being done by this particular pivot in the roadmap. And I would like to explain why I think it's such a bad idea. And there's multiple reasons I can get into. I can talk about the sequences and how decentralizing the sequences, fundamentally requires another layer of consensus, which will always inherently be weaker than the layer 1. But I think the more pressing issue is actually UX, is the user experience. Now, I'd like to just create a simple example to highlight the problem. If I'm an Ethereum user and I want to send another user Ethereum, it's very simple. I say, do you have Ethereum? Yes, I have Ethereum. I scan your QR code, and then I press send. It's a very simple, straightforward user experience as long as you trust Ethereum, right? I think that is a good user experience. Now, if we imagine what a layer 2 ecosystem looks like, what that user experience looks like, it is very different. Because with layer 2s, now if I want to do that same transaction with another user, I have to ask that user, okay, what layer 2 are you using? Right? Do I understand the security and decentralizations of that layer 2? Am I even able to directly transfer to that layer 2? Do I need to go through a bridge first? Right? So there's multiple steps that I need to take as a user in order to actually use that layer 2. That to me is a far, far worse user experience. Furthermore, breaking things up in a way where we have an ecosystem with, say, hundreds of layer 2s, right, in a free market, this creates a diversity of choice. This creates a free market of competition. And in a free market of competition, not everyone is going to agree with each other. You're going to have competing power blocks. You're going to have competing interests. So all of these solutions are not going to magically coalesce into a single interoperability protocol. I believe that is not going to happen. Right? That is a major, major issue. right? That means that compared to the alternatives, it will never be able to solve that fundamental problem. So that means that liquidity ends up being fragmented. Composability across layer 2s is fragmented. And interoperability is highly restricted, requiring a user to go through many more steps in order to reach their end goal. Now, saying all of this, you might say in response, well, that is better than any of the other alternatives we have, right? And this is why I mentioned execution sharding earlier. I'm proposing that Ethereum should, in fact, pivot back to its original roadmap, which promised the deployment of at least 64 shards initially, which the validators would be able to then validate as a whole, and every shard would be identical to each other. That is what makes a sharded system interoperable. That is what makes a sharded system far more usable, and importantly, allows still for composability between the shards. Because as long as the chain is not congested, you can use cross-shard transactions in order to solve that problem. And the cost of that will still remain very low, and it can be very automated on the back end. This is not the case with a layer 2 ecosystem, because with a layer 2 ecosystem, the only way to solve the UX problem is to take away user choice. Now, if you want to have a layer 2 ecosystem that is fully interoperable in a free market, you're going to have custodian solutions, you're going to have admin keys, you're going to have trusted bridges, and to make that interoperable is actually putting a lot of risk on the user to be able to travel through all of those different steps, where each step along the way there's a potential for failure. And also the requirement for a user to understand all of these complex mechanisms, to really assess the risk realistically instead of just using Ethereum, I think is a terrible mistake in the direction that Ethereum is heading into. And I'm saying this as an Ethereum advocate. I mined Ethereum in 2015, in the first week of launch. Ethereum has been the largest investment in the fund I manage since it launched in 2016, right? So it's not easy for me to come up on stage and say, guys, I think Ethereum is seriously taking the wrong direction here. Like, it's making a massive mistake. And if Ethereum will not scale its layer 1, I'm convinced that given enough time, competitors will in fact overtake it. Because block space is valuable. And I believe there is a massive utility that exists as part of cryptocurrency. And that utility is not captured with the layer 2 approach to scaling. Because of the fragmentation that occurs, because of the free market dynamics, which create competition, which create competing power blocks, all of these different competing companies are not all going to magically agree to use the same interoperability protocol. This is why Web 2 is also fragmented. Right? If you're transacting between different banks, different countries, right, you're going to have all sorts of delays, you're going to have all sorts of risk, you're going to take all sorts of trust assumptions. And the same is true with this idea of this layer 2 approach. And I will add, I don't believe demand is infinite. I think we can scale to meet demand. This is a critical understanding in this entire equation. Now, I would like to address another elephant in the room. Because I think it's not just the case that Ethereum is taking the wrong path in its scaling roadmap, which I definitely do think is the case. It's become a little bit worse than that. And I think Ethereum has set itself up in such a way that it has severely misaligned incentives. I would even go so far as to call this a form of corruption. And let me put this very simply, okay? There is a few $1 million, let's say, of funding for layer 1 development, through the foundation. And that money is slowly running out. And not a lot of that money is even being devoted to layer 1 scaling at this stage. A lot of it is being devoted towards layer 2. Now, if you compare that to funding for the layer 2 ecosystem, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars. Tens of billions of dollars of funding for layer 2 development, okay, compared to mere millions. I joined cryptocurrency because I believe in incentives. I believe in systems. And instead of predicting the actions of individuals, which can vary wildly. People can be very evil and very righteous, right, across that spectrum. But I think if you take a large enough group of people over a sufficient amount of time, then you can start predicting behaviors. And if you have a system that is putting billions of dollars into layer 2 development and only millions of dollars into layer 1 development, then I think that system will favor layer 1 development. Layer 2 development at the cost of the layer 1, right? That is a huge elephant in the room. And I think that is something that, the Ethereum community needs to fight, right? I've talked to so many developers that were once core developers that are now layer 2 developers. And they're certainly making a lot more money as layer 2 developers, right? This is a huge problem, right? Especially considering that layer 2 scaling is such an inferior solution from the UX perspective, from the perspective of actually creating a real DeFi economy. It's also the case, and it even has gone so far as, for instance, Arbitrum is literally buying clients, right? This to me is creating a huge perverted incentive. And I'm sad to say, and I've been a researcher in this space since 2013, this reminds me an awfully a lot of what happened to BTC as well. That's where history is repeating itself. It reminds me an awfully a lot of that, because BTC decided to restrict layer 1 capacity in favor of layer 2 capacity. And look at where it is today, right? The layer 1 is still, has the same limit as it did 10 years ago. It has not scaled. And Lightning Network, right, has a very, very small capacity. There's more BTC in the Ethereum network that's wrapped than there is in the BTC Lightning Network, right? I think one of the reasons Ethereum was so successful, I think there's multiple reasons. One was the programmability, which I think was a critical innovation for Ethereum, but also that Bitcoin reached its capacity. And fees were spiking, and Ethereum came along, and Ethereum had 10-fold the capacity of Bitcoin. And transactions were cheap, right? And that's no longer the case because we've hit capacity, and we haven't actually increased the gas limit. And I understand that there is a limit to how much we can increase the gas limit before we start to sacrifice decentralization. And this is where execution sharding, I believe, is a key solution to solving this problem. Because it allows for horizontal scaling. You're able to deploy more shards as the network scales, as activity increases. To go back to the corruption problem as well. There's also another solution for this as well. I believe the solution actually lies in decentralized governance, right? Because if you take part of the block reward and then devote that to a treasury and then build a proposal system, that's one way to create a L1 biased source of funding that's able to fund the development of the L1. Without that, I don't even think Ethereum even has the funding. Who is going to fund this sharding today? Like that's a charitable proposition. There's no money to be made there, right? This is why you need an independent source of funding. You need an independent source of funding for layer 1. And I believe the answer there lies in execution sharding. To me, this is a very sad situation to see this happen again. And, I really think the user experience is really, really lacking. Just think about it for yourselves. Fragmenting liquidity, fragmenting composability, all of this can be solved for execution sharding. That's why it was on the original roadmap, right? Today, we only have dank sharding on the roadmap, which is only sharding data. And the data is there in order to scale the layer 2s, not to scale the layer 1. That means, according to the current Ethereum roadmap, we're going to see very minimal increases in layer 1 capacity, meaning fees will remain high, meaning that if you're moving between layer 2s, sometimes you'll even have to touch the layer 1, right? I think this is an uncompetitive solution. I think the more a blockchain can scale while preserving decentralization, the more competitive that blockchain becomes. All right. I think it would be good to take some questions here. And please keep the questions short, because I will repeat the question so that the mic can hear it. Hands up. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, so the question is, what is the solution? Like, how do we solve this problem, right? So I currently believe that a lot of the Ethereum developers have made up their mind that this is the correct path forward. And they're committed. They're committed to this. And to talk about the misaligned incentive as well, if we decide to now, if we pivot back to scaling the layer one, what will happen to those billions of dollars in investment from VCs, from layer two tokens? A lot of that value is going to get wiped out. Right? We're talking about tens of billions of dollars of investment value being destroyed if we scale the layer one. That is a massive misalignment incentive. Most of the people working on, that used to work on layer one sharding, work for layer twos today. Right? So the solution to this has to be a grassroots movement. It has to be the Ethereum community itself that stands up and demands a different roadmap. And we need to convince developers, we need to convince leaders to take a different path. Because if we don't do this, long term, I'm convinced that Ethereum will lose its dominant position. I'm convinced of that. And this is why I'm standing on this stage now, warning everybody of this threat, warning you of the corruption, warning you of the misaligned incentives, warning you that this is the wrong path forward. And I really want you to take this to heart. I think this is actually one of the biggest issues that we're facing as a community. And I think we need to reopen that discussion. Because correct me if I'm wrong here, but a year ago, there wasn't a giant debate about this pivot. It just sort of happened. And the narratives just shifted over time by the influencers, by the leaders, so to speak. You know, so I think in that sense it has to be a grassroots movement. We have to start thinking about how to build opposition, how to fund competing clients that actually develop the technology that can be implemented on Ethereum. You know, I don't have all of the answers to this. There are developers out there that supported the original roadmap. For instance, the Geth developers, for example, have been outspoken about this issue. If we can find a way to fund development and actually produce code, then we can start to have a real discussion about, can we implement this code? I think that has to be the solution here. And I don't think we should just, you know, roll and show our stomachs and say, well, we're just going to do whatever the Ethereum developers say we should do. I think that's not decentralization. I think we need to think about this as a community and not just follow, you know, what the leaders say like sheep to the slaughter. All right, another question.
I think it makes great Apex better than on Twitter, I would argue.
Thank you.
But I would disagree that you say that there's like finite demand. I think demand is always infinite. So do you think there's still space for L2s for like super data hungry?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll just repeat the question here for the microphone. The question is, do I still think there is demand for layer twos? Now, I'm really happy you brought this up because I do want to bring a bit more of a measured approach here. Yes, I do think there are use cases for layer twos. Right, certainly. I think decentralized exchanges, which require high volume. I think potentially things like streaming services, where you have a relationship with a single service in which you can, say, load your capital into. Right? I think there are multiple applications where layer twos make sense. But as a replacement for layer one scaling, I think it's a flawed approach. So I mean, I think that's an important distinction to create. And I think a lot of the value around layer twos is with the assumption is that it's just going to take over all activity. And I really don't think that is a realistic scenario. What I really think would happen is, yes, you restrict layer one capacity and then more people will move to layer 2s. But even more people, I think over enough time, will move over to competitors, just because the UX is so much better, just because it maintains composability. And interoperability. I think this is very, very important, from the perspective of a user. I think as developers, it's very easy to forget, what it's like for a normal person to use cryptocurrency. I'm not talking about all of the people in this room today. I'm not talking about your average Ethereum user today. I'm talking about bringing in the masses of the world to actually be able to use this system. And they're not going to use a system where they have to think about, oh, well, does this have an admin key? Does this have a sequencer? Is this decentralized? Are my funds safe or not? Right? And also, person A and person B can't transact because that wallet doesn't share this particular interoperability protocol. That, I think, is also a terrible, terrible approach, and I think is a losing approach. This is why it's so critical that we really think about this question critically and start to engage and start to think about alternatives. I signed up to Ethereum because I thought it was going to scale the layer 1. That's why I've been such a long-time supporter. And I can continue to be a supporter in the hope that it's able to pivot back. Because I think the Ethereum has a wonderful community full of open-minded people, right? Who are happy to hear an opposing opinion. Which is why I'll step off this stage and no one's going to attack me for what I've said. And I think that is fantastic. And that's where I see the potential for the Ethereum community to still be able to pivot back, even if the narrative sounds so absolute today in terms of the direction Ethereum is taking. But we have to all keep in mind, this is a new narrative. This wasn't the case a year ago. And it is today. And we really have to ask ourselves, how was that able to change so quickly? How was that able to just shift so suddenly? I've talked to so many people who still think that the layer 1, that Ethereum is still going to scale its main chain. And it's just not the case. All right. Thank you for the question. Another question.
We have one more question.
All right, one more question. Yeah, and so the question is, can I see layer 2s as a type of testing ground, which can later be implemented in the layer 1? Absolutely. And I think the same is actually true for competing layer 1s as well. These are also testing grounds. One of the reasons I'm so confident in my position is that today there's multiple cryptocurrencies that have implemented execution sharding successfully. Multiple, right? So the code is live, it's running, they've proven that it can be done. Just to name a few, Elrond, Near, Ton, there's multiple examples of live execution sharding with multiple shards, cross-shard transactions, and it actually works. Multiple Ethereum developers have told me that it's too hard, that they can't do it. Well, if that's the case, we need different developers, if I'm being completely frank. Because if other developers can do it, then Ethereum should be able to do it as well. Especially considering that it's clearly the better approach. What are we doing here? I think the reality is that a lot of cryptocurrencies at this scale are effectively still centralized in terms of their decision making. I believe in a decentralized future, but I'm also realistic that in reality, there's influence, there's politics, there's interwoven interest, there's conflicts of interest, and what happens in the end is the decision practically of maybe 100 people tops. Okay? That is not decentralization. And that is fine when a cryptocurrency is still at an early stage. That is fine. But if we see that heading in the wrong direction, the community needs to stand up and speak out against this and actually create an opposition, create an alternative, a better path. This is why I stand here today and I'm saying Ethereum is taking the wrong path and there is a better path. And we should be taking the better path that leads to a better user experience, a more scalable blockchain, right? A more decentralized blockchain. Because, you know, this idea that in a layer 2 ecosystem, all of these layer 2s are magically going to burn their admin keys. Everyone is going to decentralize their sequences. Everyone is all just going to agree to use the same interoperability protocol. That's a fantasy. That's not taking human nature into account. You know, in a system where you allow the free market to solve this problem, you're going to end up with 100 different solutions. And that is a user experience nightmare. And it's also a nightmare for DeFi. And so many people are going to get hurt by this as well, because they're forced to use bridges. They're forced to use layer 2s that have admin keys. And we're putting so much at risk when we could just be using Ethereum. I want to scale Ethereum. Layer 2s do not scale Ethereum at all. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.